deeds, not creeds would be her motto. Do something, act, help someone. Let's not sit around and get stuck in dogma and doctrine and all these, get out there and help.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine.
Florence Nightingale returned home from the Crimean War a celebrity. She became known as the Lady with the Lamp for her role nursing soldiers back to health. And this today is how most of us remember her. But who was the real woman behind this image? In today's Life of the Week episode, Melissa Pritchard talks to Rachel Dinning about the life and legacy of the pioneering nurse, painting a broader picture of an intelligent visionary and tireless advocate for accessible healthcare.
Welcome, Melissa, to the History Extra podcast. It's great to have you. Today we're talking about the British nurse and social reformer Florence Nightingale. So my opening question to you today, so she's one of the most famous women of the Victorian period. Most people know her name, but why, in your words, does Florence Nightingale have such a legendary reputation?
Well, I would think that today that we might call Florence Nightingale a spiritual humanist, and certainly she was. But she was also, as you just mentioned, she was a complex genius, a brilliant statistician and an administrator, a tireless social reformer, the founder of modern-day nursing, and beyond that, a global visionary. That's a good start to being a legend, I think. And she was thought to be the second most influential woman of the 19th century in Britain, besides the Queen Victoria. She was born at the height of the British Empire to very wealthy, well-connected parents who assumed that she would obey the social conventions of her class and her status, which for a young woman at that time meant marry well, produce a son, so that our fortune and our properties can be passed directly down the line. Well, Florence was having none of that. This was not in her plan at all. Starting from a young age, particularly when she received what she believed to be a call from God to help those who suffered, she began to rebel pretty quickly. And she, at one point, declared the family a prison, that she felt imprisoned by family. And she declared her intention to become a nurse. And though she would have to spend years fighting her family and the rigid constraints of patriarchy, she would go on to become a nurse. And she would also, beyond that, which was enough in itself, she revolutionized Britain's public healthcare system. She used the relatively new science of statistics to bring about health reforms. She insisted on the necessity for sanitation, hygiene, proper diet in the prevention of disease. And she was an early advocate. Not everyone knows this. She was an early advocate for free, accessible health care for all persons, despite their financial status or social title or lack of title. That health care should be free for everyone. Her sympathies were always for the underprivileged and the poor. So today, I think, when we look at her today, she's best remembered as the founder. When I talk to people or ask people, something about nursing, they do remember she was the founder of modern-day nursing. A lot of people do remember that today. And immediately they come up with the image of the lady with the little white bonnet and holding the lamp. And that sort of inextinguishable symbol of the lamp. And that's about where, as far as people get, then they sort of want to know more. And so I love expanding the knowledge about Florence Nightingale. She was such a huge figure, such a polymath, and her focus was global. And whatever her vision focused on, her interest focused on, it just went that way and expanded and expanded. It was always to help others, always to improve the health and well-being of others. So I think that makes her quite a legend. She's sustained down to this over 200 years now.
As you say, people just think of her as the lady with the lamp. She's so much more than that. And we'll go into some of those things in a bit more detail later on. But I thought As we're at the start, we could go back in time a bit. You've touched on it a bit already in your previous answer, but what can you tell us about her early life and her family background, where she came from?
It's fascinating. Her parents, while her parents were on her wealthy parents were on an extended honeymoon, Florence was born May 12th, 1820, in the beautiful city for which she was named. Her sister and her only sibling, Parthenope, was born the year before in Naples. Their father, William, had inherited an enormous fortune from his great-uncle, Peter Nightingale, sometimes called Mad Peter Nightingale. And the money came largely from lead mining and cotton factories. And this is just a little background to her parents. And her mother's, Frances Nightingale's father, was William Nightingale, a progressive member of Parliament, and he worked for years with William Wilberforce to pass the 1807 Slave Trade Act, which prohibited slave trade in the British Empire. So she had quite a force of relatives behind her, especially on her mother's side, progressive Unitarians and people who were reformists in the political sphere. So after the Nightingales returned home from their travels, in 1821, Florence and Parthenope spent their childhoods living between two homes, Lea Hurst in Derbyshire. That was their summer home. And then their winter home was Embley Park in Hampshire. So they were constantly traveling back and forth. From a young age, Florence displayed a formidable intellect for a child. In fact, she had it's very sweet. She had a passion for collecting and sorting and naming and labeling things. When she was a child, she was already doing this, whether it was seashells or coins or her pets or her dolls or the vegetables in the family's vegetable garden. I mean, she had to classify everything already. You can see her notebooks. It's when she was 7 and 8. Recognizing his daughter's precocity, William did an unusual thing for his era. He decided to educate both his daughters himself and give them the equivalent of his Cambridge education. So under his tutelage, they studied the classics, philosophy, history, Latin, Greek, French, German, Italian. I'm missing something. Mathematics. I'm missing mathematics. She was fascinated by mathematics immediately. In fact, one day she would declare that numbers, particularly when they were used in the science of statistics, were the, quote, true measure of God's purpose. She also said that she could never remember a time in her childhood when she had not wanted to nurse people and animals and make them well.
You mentioned that her father wanted to give her this education. Obviously, this is a time where nurses don't really receive formal training. So how did Florence get into nursing?
I will have to begin with the 7th of February, 1837, when 16-year-old Florence had a transcendent experience, one that she carefully wrote down afterwards in her commonplace book. She was at Embley Park, sitting on a bench between two great cedar of Lebanon trees, when she heard God speak to her and call her to his service. But what form this service was to take, she further wrote in her commonplace book, God did not say. That mystical call and subsequent others that she received later in her life were to alter her destiny. And then when she declared that to her parents, her family, that nursing was to be the form that her service was to take, she could not have selected a path in life more disreputable or horrifying to her parents. Because a nurse in the 19th century in England was held in lower regard than a servant, even lower than that of an actress. And in fact, a nurse was synonymous with being a drunkard, a thief, and a prostitute. Charles Dickens's portrayal of the gin-soaked Sari Gamp in his novel Martin Chuzzlewit was a famous example of a nurse, what people thought of nurses. So for the Nightingales, Florence's determination, her declaration that she wanted to be a nurse, was really nothing short of catastrophic. So then ensued 10 years of fruitless argument between she and her parents, frequent bouts of depression on Florence's part, until in 1847, Charles and Selina Bracebridge, this was a middle-aged, childless couple, friends of the Nightingales, they invited Florence to go to Rome with them for the winter. And there she would befriend two influential persons, Madre Santa de Colombe, a French nun who served as something of a spiritual mentor to Florence, and Sidney Herbert, a young member of Parliament and a rising star in the British government. Some people pegged him for a future prime minister. Upon returning home to her miserable half-existence with her parents, who were still refusing her to train as a nurse, saying no, no, every plan she came up with was met with a no. The Bracebridges came to the rescue a second time from her depression and invited her to go with them to Egypt and Athens. So it was while she was in Egypt, in the temple of Seti I, that after years of silence from God, not knowing what he wanted of her, she heard God's voice speak to her again in this temple, asking her, would she give up all of her reputation to help those who suffered? So by the time she returned home in 1850 at the age of 30, she said that in her own words, she had, quote, settled the question with God and was more resolved than ever to become a nurse. So at this point, her parents relented. I mean, they've been at it for years, at loggerheads. And they finally relented slightly and allowed her to go to Kaiserwerth Hospital in Dusseldorf, Germany, to study with the Protestant deaconesses there. She wrote home that she had never in her life been happier than she was working in this hospital. Later, in 1853, she was in Paris working with the Sisters of Charity when she accepted a job offer to come to London and be superintendent of the Institution for the Care, I love this title, the Institution for the Care of Distressed Gentlewomen. In a surprising gesture of support, thank God, her father gave her an annual allowance from that point on of £500. This modest but crucial independence, financial independence, as Florence put it, quote, made her as free as any man. So she began work on Harley Street at this institution. Her patients, she had 27 or 28. They were women, all women, mainly governesses, educated single women, sorely broken down in health from being exploited, overworked, underpaid. And the ladies' committee that had hired Florence initially, they were so impressed at the end of her 1-year contract that they offered her a 2nd-year contract because she had just turned the whole place around. Her administration skills were brilliant. Her nursing skills were brilliant also. So they offered her the 2nd-year contract, but she ended up refusing because they couldn't. The thing she really wanted to do next was build a nursing school there as well on Harley Street. And they didn't have the money for that. So she was going to move on to something else. At that point, a cholera epidemic broke out in some of the poorest districts of London. This is in early 1854. And Florence just decided she was going to volunteer at Middlesex Hospital and nurse the cholera patients, many of whom were prostitutes, some of them children no more than 11 or 12 years old. While this was going on, the Crimean War had started in 1853. The war was a conflict between imperialist Russia and the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Sardinia. It began in 1853 as a response to the Russian expansionist ambitions. And for the first time in what's interesting about this war and so important regarding Florence is for the first time in military history, the journalists were able to go to the battlefields and report directly from there because there was now a new electric telegraph system. And so the English public back home could now read immediate eyewitness accounts of what was going on in their newspapers. And what they were reading over their breakfast tables and their dinner tables were these reports of the appalling conditions that British soldiers were being exposed to and dying from. So when the Irish war correspondent William Howard Russell published a very eloquent piece in the newspaper addressed to the women of England, saying, "Would none of you go to help these poor soldiers, women of England?" Well, Florence, reading that, said, "Well, I'm going." She thought, I'm obviously the one to go. And at the same time, simultaneously, Sidney Herbert, now Britain's Secretary at War, was penning a letter to Florence, his friend, asking if she might consider taking a small contingent of nurses to the Crimea because he could think of no other woman better qualified than she to go. It was very, it's an amazing story. So very shortly thereafter, within several weeks, Florence landed in Constantinople, now Istanbul. On November 4th, 1854, she arrived with her contingent of 38 fairly hastily selected nurses. And Sidney Herbert had given her full authority, full official government authority to be the nurse superintendent at Scutari Hospital, which was a former Turkish army barracks. If you look up a picture of it, it's huge. You can't believe the size of this place. I was there last September, and it's so enormous. And it's a quadrangle with a parade ground in the middle. It was a Turkish army barracks that was lent to the British for a hospital. But when they arrived, it was pouring rain. It was, there they are. But since British women, unlike French women, had never served as wartime nurses, she was met with a very hostile welcome. No one wanted these nurses at all to be present. The whole thing was a huge, risky experiment. And the nurses, as they got there, they were immediately confronted with a gruesome, nightmarish set of conditions. There was an utter lack of supplies, scarcely any medicine, scarcely any food that was edible, no bandages, no bedding, no clean clothing. There were thousands of the common foot soldiers laying on rotting floors, 18 inches apart, which if you measure with your hands is not very far to be laying apart, 18 inches apart on beds of soiled, bloody straw or Turkish canvas. And with the hospital's wards and corridors overrun, literally overrun with lice and rats and flooded with raw sewage. You can't imagine anything worse. So gradually, the surgeons at Scutari began to appreciate Florence and her nurses, how useful they were, how hard they worked, how they began to clean up and just did whatever they could to make things better. They did a lot. And then in March 1855, following a visit from a sanitation committee that was dispatched from London by Prime Minister Palmerston, the conditions slowly began to improve, and thus the high mortality rates due to diseases like cholera and dysentery primarily, began to drop off dramatically. I'm going to get to a part about the lady with the lamp, how this came about, how her name came about, because it starts right about here. Many of the common soldiers were recruited for a shilling and a pint of beer back in England or Ireland. Many of them were Irish. Many of them spoke only Gaelic. And these young men, her boys, as she would always call them, her boys, they worshipped her because she actually seemed to care about them personally, to care about their well-being. And when no one else seemed to, they were cannon fodder, And here she comes in and she cares for them. And she became their ministering angel. And she would walk, it was about 4 miles every night, down the corridors, through the wards, greeting each soldier, seeing if they need what they needed, a glass of whatever they needed. If sometimes they wanted a letter written home before they died, she would write the letter for them. Sometimes they wanted to say a prayer, and she would pray with them if they asked her. Whatever it was they needed, she would spend her nights doing this. And that was where her ministering angel, the lady she was carrying her lamp, which was not the little Aladdin lamp, that genie lamp we tend to see, but it was a Turkish fanus, wax-coated cylinder, accordion kind of lamp. But that's how she got the name the lady with the lamp, because she would spend her nights going up and down the corridors, looking in on the soldiers.
It's this image of Florence that we really have cemented in our collective imagination today, isn't it? This tireless nurse working on the front line of the war, really.
It totally is. It's where this whole legend began, and back home in the newspapers, it made for an irresistible story. This lovely young upper-class woman, slender young woman, gently, bravely tending to thousands of sick and wounded soldiers. I mean, it was irresistible. So Florence, I don't think she even knew it first until her family told her, she became a sensation, a romanticized story of national heroine. And the stories and illustrations of her that appeared in the newspapers were, by the way, they were wonderful distractions from useful distractions from the far less pleasant stories of military corruption, malfeasance, and bureaucratic mismanagement. So let's make this story of Florence, as sensational and beautiful as possible. But Florence, you know what? She proved to be a reluctant and even an irritable celebrity.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, how did she respond to this? She must have come back to England to all this fame.
She did come back to that fame. She tried to elude it. She really was a reluctant celebrity. She called it all the fuzz buzz. She didn't like it. She said it distracted from her work, from the emphasis on the soldiers, on what the good work she was trying to do. She didn't want to be the center of attention. And she meant it. There's very few photographs of Florence, by the way, there's just not that many. There are a lot of portraits of her by her sister, who was a watercolorist, quite skillful watercolorist, and adored her sister. But there's not a lot of images of her, because she didn't want them. But so this is a funny story, when the British artist Jerry Barrett sailed over from London, he was going to paint the best portrait of Florence, the celebrity of the day. Well, she brusquely refused to sit for him. She didn't have time, she said. She had no time to sit for him. So he had to be content with sketching a picture of her. It's a famous picture, surrounded by an entourage, including, by the way, the Bracebridges, who were intrepid and went with her to Scutari, receiving wounded soldiers from Sebastopol. So you see her in the center and wearing her little white cap and her uniform, but she's not the center. I mean, that's what he had to be content with. While she was in the Crimea, in fact, they said, the other nurses and people who saw her, said she almost never slept. She would stay, besides visiting the soldiers, walking the 4 miles, she would stay up late penning these lengthy, scathing reports to the government, members of the British government, complaining about Scutari's administrative corruption, the purveyor's ineptitude, the drunkenness and indifference among the orderlies. And as always, there were never enough supplies. So on her 35th birthday, she fell deathly ill from Crimean, what was then called Crimean fever. Today we recognize it as brucellosis. It's a disease that generally comes from drinking contaminated milk, goat's milk perhaps. And it's a chronic disease. And so she almost died, but didn't. And so when the war ended in 1856, Florence finally came home. Here's the part where she didn't want to be recognized. She came home disguised as a Miss Smith, stopped at a monastery where she knew the Reverend Mother there or something, meditated for a while, and then got on a train and came back home to Lea Hurst, unrecognized. She didn't want the fuzz buzz around her in London. There would have surely been a whole parade or God knows what would have greeted her, and she eluded it. She escaped it. And when she got off to the train station at Lea Hurst, she walked home to her family's home, Lea Hurst, completely unannounced, just walked in the door. I also think that for the rest of her life, after she got home from the Crimea, I believe she was haunted, and maybe that's not the right word, but haunted as how I feel it, by the thousands of deaths of her boys in the Crimea, and that her years of relentless reform work after she got home, even though she was ill and bedridden, she worked relentlessly for years. This work that lay ahead of her, it was perhaps her way of never abandoning them, of never forgetting them, and of making sure that such deaths never happened again, deaths that could have been prevented.
And obviously, she went on to reform healthcare and nursing in England, possibly because of this, as you say. How did she go about doing this? What did she do to reform how we approached healthcare?
This is where the picture, we've gone up to the first half of her life, so it's, less than half, but the next 50 years of her life, she lived to be 90, then are just with all her accomplishments, mostly done from her bed. As I said, she had brucellosis, the after effects. She was in a lot of pain. She had to sometimes be carried across the room. She couldn't walk. She had many, and she was frequently very ill, but she still managed to work from her flat. She had a flat, a modest flat. She never lived grandly at all. She lived very modestly. She had a flat near Parliament so that the members of Parliament who were her friends and advocates could easily pop over and have a meeting with her, which they did all the time. So she was a reformist. She was an innovator. I want to say she wasn't a revolutionary. She was like a reformist who worked within the system, the existing systems, to change them. And she really brilliantly used her celebrity, which, as I said, she didn't like, but she used it along with her political connections strategically to improve healthcare, to get the votes through, to get the bills passed. She started with healthcare in the military and the public hospitals. As I think I mentioned in the beginning, that she believed in accessible free healthcare for everyone. So to my mind, that makes her an early progenitor of the NHS, National Health Service. So she worked very closely with everyone, passing reform measures. She enlisted her friends and advocates in Parliament to deliver her speeches for her, because women at that time were not allowed in Parliament, much less were they able to give speeches. So these men would do it for her. Sidney Herbert was one. Sir Henry Verney was another. There were others who stood up and gave her speeches for her so that these bills could be passed to improve hospital systems. There were so many. It's really complicated, all the things she worked on. She also is known for pioneering the use of statistical diagrams. She called them coxcombs. Today we call them pie charts, to illustrate causes of disease and mortality. She already understood that an attractive visual diagram, or a pretty diagram, was far more effective than a dull bar chart or a table of numbers in persuading those people who needed to be persuaded of the necessity for health reforms. And she was absolutely right about that. She said, nobody's going to look at these tables of numbers and graphs, but they will look at a pretty design of a chart that shows the same statistics. So that was a huge thing that a huge innovation she brought to the healthcare system. And now I'm so aware now of how much we use statistics. I always see them in the newspapers and magazines, and especially around healthcare, the use of numbers in these diagrams. And I always think of Florence. So that's one thing she did also. Also in 1860, so she would have been 40. I'm always figuring her age out. She published a wonderful book called Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not. And it was addressed specifically to Victorian housewives, wives and mothers, because they were the ones charged with taking care of any of the sick members of the household, including servants. Her book, Notes on Nursing, immediately outsold all the works of Dickens, who was the most popular writer of the day. And it is still in print today. I've read it twice. It's not only charming, her writing, she's a wonderful writer, quite a sense of humor too. She's a wonderful writer, and it's still relevant, some of the things that she talks about. The second thing she did in 1860 that was, she's most known for today even, is she opened the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital. And this was the world's, not just England's, but the world's first professional secular school for nurses. I underline secular. She didn't want it to be a religious training school, She didn't want nuns, although she really admired the nuns.
Oh, that's so interesting. Even though she was religious herself, wasn't she?
She was, but she kept it quite private in a lot of ways, because she was a bit heretical in her thinking. I'll get into that in a minute, but she didn't, especially in the Crimea, she didn't want the nuns who were there as nurses. She forbade them to do any deathbed conversions. That was a reason to send them home. She was really against that. She was really against, she wanted people to come to their own belief in their own way, whatever their belief was, which is very broad-minded of her, I thought. A couple of things I want to mention that are lesser known about her. They're coming to be a bit better known, thanks to people like the biographer Mark Bostridge, who's done a beautiful biography of her, and Lynn MacDonald, who's done a whole 16 volumes of Florence's own writings, explicated. One of Florence's lesser-known accomplishments was her introduction of professionally trained nurses and midwives into England and Ireland's notoriously awful workhouses for the poor. Up until that time, if you were in a workhouse, if you were a poor person in a workhouse, you became ill, or you were pregnant and about to give birth, there was no one to help you except other paupers who lived there, and they weren't trained either. So she said, this has to change. And she did get that to change. That was huge. A second achievement that's not much mentioned is after the Crimea, I think starting at about 1860, she got involved in India. She started first, this is all from her bed in her little flat, she went around the world. But she got involved first in looking at the British Army's health system in India. It's a colonialist system. They had colonized India, but she turned her attention to the health conditions of the army. But right away from there, she expanded and broadened her focus to include local populations all across India, the sanitation, the hygiene, principles of irrigation and farming, all kinds. She already had a little bit of an ecological awareness too. In fact, she would become recognized as a leading authority in India's health, the health of India's civilian populations. And her work was even recognized and praised by Mahatma Gandhi.
Do we know much about her personal life?
She was about her faith. She was a deeply private person. And she kept her faith. She was broad-minded, open-minded, ecumenical. But she didn't talk about her faith much. She kept it private to herself. She had a few close friends, male friends who were interested in theology and wrote about theology, also people at Cambridge, all very esteemed scholars of religion. They were her friends, and they would sit and talk, and some of them read her book, but that was never published, but they read copies. And some of them got in trouble for their beliefs, with the church, because they did publish articles, but she never did. I think her compassion, her faith was her compassion was pragmatic. You could almost say deeds, not creeds, would be her motto. Do something, act, help someone. Let's not sit around and get stuck in dogma and doctrine and all these, get out there and help. Maybe because she was a chronic invalid, she was bedridden, frequently ill. She often believed that her time was short. She didn't have much time left on the earth. So that caused her to drive those around her relentlessly, as relentlessly as she drove herself to accomplish these many, many reforms and changes. So depending on what biographical interpretation you read of her, Nightingale can sometimes come off, she sometimes comes off as a peculiar cross between a saint and a scold. And I am going to round that out a little bit because I think it's quite incomplete. And I'm going to tell some things I have learned about her that will soften her and make you go, oh, Florence, humanize her in a way that's very real. First of all, to speak about her personal life, she loved her young cousins and her family in the final years of her life when she could no longer work. She wasn't well enough to work in the last years of her life, so she spent a lot of time with the young members of her family. She loved the children and the babies. She had a lifelong love of animals. In Greece, she rescued a baby owl that was being tormented by some boys that had fallen out of a tree, and she named it Athena and made a beloved pet of Athena for years. In Scutari, while she was there, she was given a gift of a tortoise named Jimmy, and Jimmy liked to accompany her on her rounds. She took comfort in her beloved cats. I think someone said once, throughout her whole life, she probably had about 60 cats. But when she was in her flat on South Street in London, she had at one time 14 Persian cats. And some of them were named after famous generals and politicians like Gladstone, Disraeli, Bismarck was her favorite cat. And they each had these 14 cats each had their own china bowls, china dishes to eat out of with their special diets. And at tea time, they would sometimes be given rice pudding. You know.
Amazing.
And she did often work from her bed. She often had a cat knotted, as she called it, knotted around her neck. And if you ever get a chance to go to the British Library and see any of her papers, you very well might come upon, here and there, little paw prints crossing the pages. And when she was a young woman, she was, from description, she was very attractive, more than her sister Parthenope. She was more marriageable material than her sister, which really irked her mother because, instead Florence wants to go be a nurse and never get married. But she did have suitors. She was, I think she was slightly intimidating. Her intelligence would intimidate some of her suitors because she could speak fluent Latin and Greek, and she didn't pretend that she couldn't. So she was very admired for her wit. Her most serious suitor, who tried for 7 to 8 years to get her to marry him, was Monckton Milnes, who was a member of Parliament, a poet, and the first biographer of the poet John Keats. And she finally turned him down. She kept equivocating for years and then finally turned him down because I think she realized if she married him, she couldn't answer that call that she had, that mystical call that she had received to serve the sick and the suffering. So that idea of being called for her, called by something higher, however, you may think it's God or not, or however your one's particular belief in or psychology is, but she felt definitely called by God, and she wanted to she honored that, even though it was a sacrifice for her.
I'm aware that we're getting to the end of the podcast now. So I think my closing question for you is, you've talked about Florence so wonderfully and passionately and given such a full, colourful picture of this woman. Do you think we need to reconsider how we view Florence and her legacy going forwards?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is, I am passionate about that because I went into learning about her, doing my research, and I had a sort of, I guess I could say almost stereotypical view of her. I still admired her and wanted to know about her, but my view of her was a bit narrow. And after all my studying and reading, I'm just so blown away by the breadth of her knowledge and her wisdom and her practicalness, and how modern she is in a way. After the Crimean War, after she'd become this national heroine and a household word, and she'd been sentimentalized and mythologized and bronzed, cast in bronze in Waterloo Place, when there were all these affordable little statues of Florence around that you could buy that vaguely resembled the Virgin Mary, when poems were recited about her, songs were sung about her, little girls were named after her, and her name and the Lady of the Lamp became synonymous with the ideal Victorian woman. The truth, I say still the truth is to me that all this romanticized iconization of her has overshadowed and obscured much of her innovative work, which, thanks to current scholars today and biographers, we're rediscovering so much that she did and so much more than she thought. And so we're getting a new portrait of her. She is relevant. She is inspirational. She does offer us an example of courage and purpose and an example of servant leadership in the world, which I think we really need today. We could really use that.